thermodynamics and non-equilibrium systems. So these themes were themes that Grégoire Nicolis worked a lot on, and so I think that Massimiliano would tell you more about this because he has some sort of history of stochastic thermodynamics to tell us about. And so Massimiliano, the floor is yours. So Massimiliano Esposito, you're from, yes, it's written,
Yeah.
Université de Luxembourg, right?
Yeah. No, it's somewhere on my slide. Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. And I will try to honor the memory of Grégoire in this presentation. I will first briefly comment on my connection to Grégoire. So for me, the direct connection is via the teaching of Grégoire. He was my statistical mechanics teacher, and he also taught me nonlinear dynamics. I completely second what Anne de Witt was saying. He was a fantastic teacher. And I mean, this certainly played a very important role in me deciding to later pursue a career in statistical physics. I should also say that at the time where I did my PhD, he was heading CENOLI, the Center for Nonlinear Phenomena in Complex System. And this also played an important role, as Anne was also commenting on. We had a weekly seminar, very international, very diverse. I think these were formative years, and being exposed to a diversity of topic was very important, and certainly gave me this multidisciplinary mindset that was so dear to Grégoire. Then I would say indirectly, the effect of Grégoire is also huge, because two of the main people, the people who influenced most my career, Pierre Gaspard, because he was my PhD advisor, and I owe him so much. And also later Christian van den Broek, who became my main collaborator during my postdoc years. Both did their PhD with Grégoire. So one can say that I was clearly strongly influenced by these ideas, and more broadly the ideas of the Brussels School. So this is why I decided to give a talk, which, without entering too much in the technicalities, but more trying to emphasize how my research in recent years has been in the natural continuation, I would say, of the ideas of the Brussels School. And I will start with the book that many people mentioned during this conference, by Nicolis and Prigogine, Self-Organization on Equilibrium System. It's a fantastic book. And the book starts with linear irreversible thermodynamics, as we know, close to equilibrium. And then moves to complexity, but from a dynamical perspective. There's a transition showing that stability can be lost, and things happen far from equilibrium, but then somehow thermodynamics is abandoned along the way. And the focus is on nonlinear dynamics, fluctuation, chemical reaction networks. And somehow, you know, there's this question, okay, but what actually happens to the thermodynamics of those systems? And I would say that this is more recently that we started to investigate this question, although already around the 80s, Grégoire himself did early contribution to the field of stochastic thermodynamics, which tries to define, to study the thermodynamics of systems far from equilibrium. And so I would say initially, I mean, it's fair to say that until maybe 5 to 10 years ago, the focus was on small systems, but I would say more recently, we are moving to more complex systems, and that's what I want to emphasize, that I think it would be very interesting to complement all this study of complex system that until now were mostly dynamical with a thermodynamic perspective. And I underline thermo and dynamics because somehow thermodynamics, traditional thermodynamics is more thermostatics, but now it's really the time to build uh, thermodynamics on top of dynamics to have a truly non-equilibrium thermodynamics of these complex systems and be able to make energetic statements about these complex systems, not only dynamical ones. So I will, the brief outline is I will give you the main ingredients of stochastic thermodynamics, some historical comments on it, and then use chemical reaction network to show you how one class of complex system can be used to develop a non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And also it's a topic that was dear to the Brussels School since a long time, the chemistry. And if I have time, I will also show some more recent result on nonlinear electrical circuits with some application that have technological relevance. So stochastic thermodynamics in a nutshell, I should say that it can be also formulated in terms of Fokker-Planck equation, but I will use here the master equation formulation for discrete states. So we start with the dynamics that is a master equation. You should think of it as the dynamics of a system coupled to an environment, where the states of the system are I, and there's a rate matrix, a transition matrix telling us what's the probability per unit time to make a transition between state J and I. And we can discriminate different mechanisms, and this will be reservoirs actually that trigger these transition. As you see in my little drawing here, we may have two different mechanisms connecting a same pair of states. And we assign an energy, a Gibbs free energy, which can be split into an energetic contribution and internal entropy. So this entropy, you should really think of it as the equilibrium entropy inside the state, the hidden degrees of freedom of the state itself. And the connection with thermodynamics and dynamics happen via this key assumption of local detail balance, where we impose that the log of the ratio of the forward and backward rate for a given mechanism has this typical form, a difference of Gibbs free energy and potentially a force, a non-conservative force that could come from a hydrolyzing ATP or a gravitational field, lifting a weight, something like that. Or rather the opposite of lifting. I mean, you know already that in absence of a force, this condition will guarantee that the system reaches a Gibbs distribution in the energy landscape given by this Ji. But we now have also these forces that will be able to drive the system away from equilibrium. I will use an isothermal formulation for simplicity of the presentation, but everything I say can be generalized. Then let's go to the ensemble average description of stochastic thermodynamics. What one does is one defines the expectation value of the energy, the entropy as expectation value of the internal entropy plus Shannon contribution, which captures the entropy stored in the distribution itself. And one can define the associated Gibbs free energy using the equilibrium inspired form. And then by looking at the derivative of the entropy, working a bit the formulas and splitting them in two contributions, one can identify the heat, which is this. And you see that here we have the change in energy minus the work occurring during a given transition. So it makes sense to call this the heat average over all the possible transitions. And the important thing is that the difference between the entropy change and the heat divided by T is a quantity that is always positive, greater or equal to 0. And that measures the break of detail balance being the condition where the probability for a transition by a given mechanism in one direction is completely compensated by the probability of that mechanism happening in the opposite direction. So this quantity is a quantity really measuring how detail balance is broken by the dynamics. The work is then, of course, the expectation of these non-conservative works. One may also have a contribution if one allow the energy to depend on time. This, in the early works of Crookes and Jasinski, this was the case. One will also get a driving contribution to the work due to this parametric change of the energy in time. Then an important point is that one can rewrite this entropy production by identifying the fundamental forces and fluxes in the system. This decomposition, I will not detail how to do it, but I want to emphasize that it really depends on the topology of the graph described. So, you know, the graph is the graph of the possible transitions. So it plays a role in defining which is the set of fundamental forces and currents. You can view it as a consequence of it's a way of redefining the energy landscape by really capturing the essential non-conservative feature in the dissipation. And then one gets this decomposition. These are the parametric contribution due to this energy dependence. So most of the time I will assume that this is zero. And then we have here the total derivative of this Gibbs free energy modified because I moved some potential contribution from this F inside the G to redefine the G. Now, why is this important? Because at steady state, in a non-equilibrium steady state, where we don't drive the system via the parametric energies and where this total derivative of G will be zero, the entropy production will be expressed in terms of these fundamental fluxes and currents, like in phenomenological thermodynamics. So this makes contact with the phenomenological irreversible thermodynamics. And when the forces, now moving to another case, when the forces are zero, the system is said to be detail balanced. It's a weaker condition than saying that all the individual forces are zero. This can involve certain combinations of them only being zero. Then the system, in absence of driving, will always diminish this modified Gibbs free energy, which becomes a Lyapunov function for the dynamics, and the system will relax to equilibrium. Sorry. And another typical setup is if we are at equilibrium, but we do a slow drive in this detail balance system, then we have reversible transformation and we recover the standard relations from equilibrium thermodynamics. Now let's move to the fluctuation level, which is really the novelty that happened in the very last years of the 20th century. The entropy production can be defined at the level of stochastic trajectory. Think of the trajectory as a sequence of states visited in time, but also discriminating which transition, which reservoir caused the transition between the pairs of states. Then if one takes the log ratio of these probabilities of histories, forward versus backward in time, the time reverse one gets the entropy production, whose expectation value is the entropy production that I mentioned before in the ensemble average description, and which can be expressed as a relative entropy, which further confirms this interpretation of entropy production as a statistical measure of time reversal breaking. And it also leads to the celebrated fluctuation theorem, stating that the probability to observe a certain fluctuation in the entropy production divided by minus that entropy production has this simple exponential form. Other interesting places where relative entropy enter is that the Gibbs free energy minus the equilibrium one is also a relative entropy, and it's always positive, and it can be interpreted as the minimal work needed to drive the system from that equilibrium distribution to that non-equilibrium one. And also this relative entropy of the entropy production here, when coarse-grained goes down, meaning that coarse graining underestimates entropy production. That's also something very important for application. One should always keep that in mind. Now let me make some historical comments. Clearly, to me, the ideas of stochastic thermodynamics go back to the phenomenological approach of irreversible thermodynamics by the pioneers. I highlighted the Brussels people, of course, Onzaga was also very important, but the Donner, Prigogine, and Onzaga. Actually, that history goes way back. I think a remarkable paper is the one, that's one of the first I know, which introduces local detail balance, is Berkman-Lebowitz. Then there's the work of Schnackenberg and Hill, mainly focused on steady state, but which starts seeing connection between the topology of the graph and the entropy production at steady state. And then I want to highlight the work of Grégoire and Christian Vandenbroek in the mid-80s, where they really formulate the average stochastic thermodynamic that I presented for chemistry, and also starting to ask an interesting question that if I have time, I will elaborate a bit on that, is the connection between the stochastic thermodynamics and the macroscopic thermodynamics, because chemistry has a macroscopic limit when molecules numbers become large. And these are the first studies looking at how can they mismatch and show that they actually match for linear chemical reaction networks. I should also mention this paper, which was brought to my attention by Hong Qian, which is actually, I think this is the father, and this is another family relative of Hong Qian, where the entropy production is defined at the trajectory level and then only ensemble average to show that it connects with this previous work in a Chinese journal. And he told me that this work was really inspired by the book of Prigogine, which was one of the first to appear in China after the Cultural Revolution. And then the big boom that happened in stochastic thermodynamics with fluctuation theorem. I put here parentheses because these are the earliest works, but not for stochastic dynamics. So I don't want to enter into the detailed history. But for Hamiltonian dynamics, it appeared actually in the 70s, then for thermostatic dynamics in the 90s. But the real stochastic thermodynamics, as I presented it, is associated to this pioneering work by Jarzynski and Crookes. Then Sekimoto, Kochan, Chris Maas in 99. And I highlight here also Pierre Gaspard, because you see the influence of chemistry in the Brussels School. He actually realized that this concept could be applied to chemistry, and looked at the fluctuation theorem in chemical system and at the discrepancy occurring between the stochastic and macroscopic theory when there are phase transition like in the Schlegel model. So this is also a very interesting paper. So to show you that, I forgot to mention, of course, that the first paper by Bachmann and Lebowitz was explicitly referring to these ideas of irreversible thermodynamics and motivated by that. So the Brussels School clearly had its strong influence on these developments, and Nicolis was part of that history. Now let me briefly go to chemical reaction networks. I don't have time to go into the details, but let me start by saying that we can describe them stochastically. And the key point to describe open chemical reaction networks, because we want to look at systems that are driven out of equilibrium, is to discriminate internal species from chemostatic species, so species that are controlled from the outside. So this is, for instance, metabolism, or every metabolic network belongs to the class of open chemical reaction network. This is like a simpler network to illustrate the theory. So here, for instance, we can hold A and B fixed, imagining that whenever it is consumed, there's a mechanism bringing it back into the system. Based on that, the internal species are described stochastically. The chemostat that one are described by macroscopic concentrations. The dynamics of these numbers of internal species satisfies the chemical master equation. This is very much in line with what was described in the book that I mentioned at the beginning by Prigogine and Nicolis, or Nicolis and Prigogine. We have mass action kinetics and the local detail balance, which I wrote in a way that is reminiscent of what I presented, with the change in Gibbs free energy, assuming that we are in ideal homogeneous solution, and potentially for reaction that involve chemostated species, the contribution to the change in Gibbs free energy due to the chemostat. And you see also crucial this entropic contribution, which will give rise to the entropic contribution in the macroscopic theory. So one can do stochastic thermodynamics at that level. Of course, doing it for a large network is practically impossible, which is why one often goes to the macroscopic limit. In the macroscopic limit, the description can be mapped into, it becomes a deterministic nonlinear dynamics for the internal concentrations and the chemostated ones, which now, as Pierre was mentioning yesterday in the comment, there is a source term here that is precisely due to the mechanism, the external mechanism controlling these chemostated species. And one can work by analogy and construct a first law and a second law in very much the spirit of what we do for stochastic thermodynamics. But now, instead of dealing with concentration, we are dealing with, instead of dealing with probabilities, we're dealing with concentrations. So the notion of entropy becomes a Shannon-like notion for concentration. But since the probability is not conserved, we also have this additional term that captured this lack of conservation of the entropy, and they all originate in the macroscopic limit from this log n factorial here at the stochastic level, because the probability of the distribution itself has no entropy anymore in the macroscopic limit. One can also rewrite, as I mentioned for the basic stochastic thermodynamics, one can rewrite the entropy production in terms of a sum of fundamental forces and fluxes, which again will depend on the topology, not of the network here, which is actually the stoichiometric matrix characterizing the system, and this total derivative of the Gibbs free energy of the system. In the simple system that I mentioned here, where I only have two chemostated species, the dissipation will be controlled by the current connecting these two chemostats and the difference of chemical potential between A and B. This is what I wrote here. So there's only one current and one force, but in a complex network, one really needs to analyze the stoichiometric matrix to identify how many of these forces and fluxes are present in the system. And then with that, both the stochastic and the deterministic description, we have a tool to study all the complexity that we know can arise in chemical reaction networks, all the bifurcations, or we can call them non-equilibrium phase transition. We can now analyze them from a thermodynamic perspective, and I will give you some examples here. I add diffusion. It's a straightforward extension. One simply adds a Fick law to this dynamical equation, and concentration become fields. And in that context, we can, for instance, explicitly show that the work needed to make a transition between one type of state of the entire chemical reaction network, which might be homogeneous, and bring it to a Turing pattern, for instance, the minimal cost for it, of course, in practice is going to be much higher, as we know, it's always the case in thermodynamics, but the minimal cost will be given by this relative entropy, not defined at the probability level as before, but now at the level of concentrations between the two patterns. So that's quite interesting. And one can also show that the state of a pattern compared to the space average version of the pattern um, is always, so the relative entropy is always bigger, meaning that the thermodynamic interpretation of that is it always takes work, chemical work from the chemostats in order to structure things in space. So these were things that, of course, are said in words in the early days, in the 70s. We knew that to get pattern, one had to go far from equilibrium. But this is now a way to quantify explicitly how much, what is the minimal cost to produce those patterns. Another, this is really a transition between two states. One can also look at the steady state situation where one changes a parameter and one goes through the Turing instability. So this curly J has a kink here. The derivative has really a jump. So this is reminiscent of what we know at equilibrium. But of course, one may, the G curly doesn't capture the dissipation going on in the steady state itself. So it's also very important to look at the entropy production. And what we observe here, which is interesting, is that when crossing the Turing instability, the total entropy production has no kink, but there's a sudden activation of the entropy production due to diffusion, which is obvious because before there was no structuring in space, so the diffusion was not activated. And this increase in the diffusion dissipation is actually giving rise to a decrease in the dissipation due to the chemistry, where here we have the reaction part of the dissipation minus the one happening in the homogeneous states just before the transition. So it's interesting that in a sense, it's like chemistry starts to dissipate less because there's an increase in the diffusion dissipation, the dissipation due to diffusion. Very briefly, one can also look at the cost for creating chemical waves. For instance, in a Fisher wave, all the dissipation is localized in the front because it's a process of relaxation to equilibrium. While this is a model where we to do the analytics, we really looked at another paper by Nicolis where he analyzed the brusellator in detail in a situation where wave propagate in the system, and that system, of course, dissipates a lot because one needs to first sustain the steady state is already burning a lot of energy, and the contribution of the wave is only a small one on top of this basic contribution. So that's the main message I wanted to get through here. Now I only have 2 minutes left, so I will not go into much detail beside telling you that one more recent work that we did is to also study nonlinear electronics circuits using stochastic thermodynamics. It's relevant technologically because lowering the size of transistors and also the wish to diminish the power with which computation is performed for ecological reasons is a main concern. And when one does that, thermal noise becomes crucial. And describing thermal noise in nonlinear circuit in a thermodynamically consistent way is a challenge. And most of the engineering literature does modeling that is not thermodynamically consistent. And so we use stochastic thermodynamics to do so. And our theory really builds on the IV characteristics of the device and local detail balance. So we can deal with a large class of devices. And basically the picture is that we have conductors. Some of them are the analog of chemostatic, which is controlled by voltage sources. And the other ones are free, and electrons can hop between these different conductors. And with this kind of modeling, one can really look at actual models of memories. For instance, This is a SD-RAM memory based on MOSFET transistors, where we can really create a bistable system when powering the system. So the B-stability here really emerges as a consequence of the powering. We can study the dissipation, discrepancies between the deterministic theory and the fluctuating one, and using large deviation theory, get explicit expression for the error rates in this bistable regime in terms of the entropy production in the system. So since my time is over, I will skip this slide and I will conclude by saying that I hope I could at least give you a good motivation for why complementing the dynamical perspective on complexity with a thermodynamic one is important, and to show you how this is a program that naturally fits in the line of research developed in Brussels and in particular by Grégoire Nicolis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Massimiliano. I'm sure there are questions. Actually, I already see one hand risen. It's an old friend, Anselmo.
Hi, Yannick. Hi, Massimiliano.
Hello.
It's great to see your presentation. Unfortunately, yeah, I had something before, and I could only attend the second half. So for me, it's quite interesting that you are looking at what happens so around the bifurcation point. So if my understanding is correct, so at the onset of a critical transition, the excess entropy should become negative. So as a manifestation of the instability at the thermodynamic level. My question is, what's the in this picture? What's the effect of this?
Okay. So there's no really excess entropy in the total entropy production. First of all, I should say that here I'm only focusing on the deterministic level, and we know that there might be strong discrepancies close to phase transition between deterministic and stochastic. So that's the first thing, as I showed on the circuit, and as Pierre showed in the Schlegel model. Here, but assuming we can focus on the deterministic level, here the total entropy production is actually smooth when going through the phase transition. What the discontinuity is in the part of the dissipation due to diffusion versus the one due to reaction. Reaction can dissipate less because it has activated diffusion. So there's a kink into the diffusion and reaction contribution, but not in the sum of the two. I should add that this is, I don't know if this is general. This is something that we saw in this model, which is the Brusselator model. It could be that other models do not display this kind of properties.
Thank you. And by the way, I want to take this opportunity to also thank the organizers. It's been really great seminar, fantastic topics, and I can very well imagine Grégoire hitting the point with his questions after each of all these interesting talks. And yeah, thank you, Anne David, Pierre, Yannick, all the organizers.
Okay. But thank you, Anselmo. It was nice not to see you again, but to hear you again. But unfortunately, time is running really fast now. It's already 9:35. So remember that there will also be opportunities to discuss in the meeting